Thank you, girls. And now we move to our second and final speaker. I'm very excited to briefly introduce Vanessa Cavanagh. Vanessa Cavanagh is an associate lecturer and a PhD student at the University of Wollongong. Her research focuses on Aboriginal women and cultural burning in New South Wales. She studies and teaches the behavior, ecology, and management of wildfire, often in the frame of prescribed burning. I'm very excited for your presentation, and she will now speak on Aboriginal women and cultural burning in New South Wales, Australia. Thank you, Vanessa.
Lovely. Thank you, Simona. I'll just jump in and share my screen. Got my sound on.
Yes, we can hear you perfect.
Lovely. And that's my screen being shared. Is that coming across well?
Yes, we see it very well. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay. Jingiwala, Nyanyeri, Vanessa Cavanagh. Mamirang, Bungam, Bundjalung, Bundjalung Jagan, Bundjalung Dubai, and Wonnarua woman. To translate, hello, I'm Vanessa Cavanagh. I'm a First Nations woman from the Bundjalung and Wonnarua Aboriginal nations. Today I'm speaking to you from the continent now known as Australia. In this webinar, I'm going to share with you some of my social science research, which looks at Aboriginal women and cultural burning fire practices here in New South Wales. But in order to do that properly, and firstly, I want to acknowledge country. So in doing so, provide a cultural introduction to myself and to my work. So in case you're not familiar, there are hundreds of Indigenous nations across Australia. And this is what this map is showing. There is no single one Australian Indigenous culture. Where I live in the state of New South Wales, I live in a city called Wollongong, and that's the lands of the Darawal people. And that's what the red arrow on the screen is pointing to here. But where I live is not my traditional homelands. My ancestral country are Bundjalung and Wonnarua nations. So on the screen, you can see the larger blue circle is circling the Bundjalung Aboriginal country, and the Wonnarua nation is being circled by the green circle there. So I acknowledge that even though I'm an Aboriginal woman, I'm a visitor here on somebody else's country. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I pay my respect to the ancestors and the spirits of this land that are always present. I'm grateful to be invited to talk with you here today on PyroLife, and I pay my respects to other First Nations people watching from around the globe, and to the ancestors of those lands on which you stand, wherever you are watching in from. So, Boogle Bear, thank you. So there were some statistics that were mentioned in my abstract that have been updated. So you might note some changes here. But during 2019 and 2020, Australia suffered from unprecedented wildfires. The fires burnt across every Australian state and mainland territory. As you can see from the inset map here, the fires extended from Tasmania down the south, all along the east coast to far north Queensland and across the west to Western Australia. Over 18 million hectares, or 46 million acres, were burnt in these fires. This includes forests, national parks, and agricultural lands. Thousands of homes and buildings were destroyed or damaged, and infrastructure like fences, roads, power and communication lines were disrupted or destroyed. The total financial cost of these fires is predicted to be in the tens of billions of dollars. Wildlife and livestock were also decimated, with estimates of over 1 billion animals killed in the fires. The impacts on endangered and threatened species are difficult to quantify. However, it is understood that extinctions have occurred from these fires. 34 people died as a direct result of the fires, including volunteer firefighters and an air tanker plane that crashed, killing the pilot and crew. Additionally, over 400 people died from the effects of the bushfire smoke. Hazardous air quality levels were observed for days, In the Australian Capital Territory, our national capital, air quality was recorded at 23 times the above hazardous levels for many days. And this saw increased hospital admissions of more than 3,000 people for respiratory and health concerns like asthma. It was a summer of thick blanketing smoke that stretched across the land, choking cities and towns far from the fires themselves. In January 2020, NASA estimated that 306 million tonnes of CO2 had been emitted from the fires. This is over half of Australia's average annual CO2 emissions of 533 million tonnes. The smoke spread around the globe, past New Zealand, where the skies turned orange over Auckland and brown soot was recorded on the glaciers. You can see in that satellite image there on the screen, the milky blanket of smoke that stretches from Southeast Australia, covering Aotearoa, New Zealand's South Island entirely. The smoke spread past New Zealand, over the Pacific Ocean, to South America, Chile, Argentina, distances over 10,000 kilometres. This event has been named the Black Summer Bushfires. However, this name itself conveys a false representation. In reality, the fires started months before our summer started, which is the 1st of December in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's evidence of our ever-changing fire season. Amid the fire crisis, people sought better solutions for fire management. Attention turned to Aboriginal fire knowledge and practice. The focus on Indigenous knowledges relates to the longevity of Indigenous peoples here, our existence here. For Aboriginal people in Australia, we are the longest continuing culture on the face of the earth. Fire is an integral part of Aboriginal culture, and it is founded on healthy, respectful relationships of coexistence with the natural world, what is sometimes referred to as caring for country. Aboriginal people have successfully lived with fire for thousands of generations prior to colonisation in 1788. Aboriginal societies and longevity have not survived and thrived in Australia by accident. That colourful map that I showed you earlier illustrates that some of the multicultural diversity that exists here. This has existed for thousands and thousands of generations. This kind of longevity requires governance, diplomacy, as well as scientific knowledge of the entire ecosystem. And it's particularly pertinent given Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. Caring for country is about our relationship and sustainable existence with the planet. It is more than an ecological or biophysical exercise. It encompasses a whole range of factors. Aboriginal land management on the whole engages with science, education, medicine and technology, health and well-being, as well as cultural identities. It is place-based learning that enacts cultural responsibilities, and these have existed with Aboriginal communities for thousands and thousands of years. But with European colonisation came genocide. Indigenous peoples suffered disease, removal of lands, destruction of culture and family and social structures, and the minimalisation or disregard of our Indigenous knowledges in models of environmental and ecosystem management. The legacy of colonisation today and the lived experiences of Indigenous people is that we are only 3% of the total Australian population, so we're clearly a minority group. We experience poor social indicators across the risk spectrum, with lower than average or below parity statistics for socioeconomic outcomes, health and wellbeing indicators, and representation in mainstream government structures. In spite of this ongoing disaster, Indigenous peoples maintain efforts to self-determining action, to sustain and invigorate our cultural fire knowledge and practice, including in locations where it has been marginalised through colonisation, such as the southeast of the continent where the effects of colonisation first impacted. So what is cultural burning? Cultural burning is a term often used in New South Wales for the use of fire by Aboriginal people as a caring for country activity. Its practice It's a practice that has been occurring in Australia for as long as people have inhabited the continent. The word cloud on the screen here shows some of the different names that you might be more familiar with, things like fire stick farming and cultural low intensity burns. I refer to the Fire Sticks Alliance Corporation description of cultural burning, and they quote, "The term cultural burning is used to describe burning practices developed by Aboriginal people to enhance the health of the land and its people. Cultural burning can include burning or prevention of burning of country for the health of particular plants and animals, bush foods and threatened species, or biodiversity in general. It may involve patch burning to create different fire intervals across the landscape, or it could be used for fire and for fuel and hazard reduction. Fire may be used to gain better access to country, to clean up important pathways, to maintain cultural responsibility, and as part of cultural heritage management. It is a ceremony to welcome people to country, or it could be as simple as a campfire around which people gather to share, learn, and to celebrate." So what you must understand is that Australia is a really large continent, and that with it being such a large continent, there are hundreds of distinct Indigenous cultural groups, each with their own specific cultural protocols relating to caring for country, including cultural burning. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. And this diversity means that in some cultural groups, women hold the knowledge of cultural burning. In some places, cultural burning is women's business. And these cultural protocols have to be honoured in our cultural activities. But even with the diversity across Australia, there are principles that underpin Indigenous caring for country practice. And these are upholding healthy, sustainable relationships with country. Fire is a key part of caring for country to create sustainable relationships with all of life by reducing the risks of wildfire, promoting resources, food, and continuing natural and cultural life cycles. So cultural burning is quite distinct from dominant conventional Western burning practices, which I'll briefly describe next. However, there are some similarities as well. So looking at the dominant models of fire landscape fire management, these are based on Western concepts of nature. Here, fire is layered with negative or oppressive connotations. The approach is focused on fire suppression, fire fighting, prescribing and controlling fire. The process of burning is often aggressive, with large-scale blocks burnt entirely. The fires are hot and fast, and the flame heights are high. The ignition is often quick and assisted with fuels, drip torches, or aerial incendiary, creating continuous fire lines that march across the landscapes. Usually, Western fire management only involves adults with specific qualifications and accreditations that are all based on Western models. There's the permit system, burn windows, and safety standards, and strict personal protective equipment, which are needed with the dangerous conditions. In contrast, Indigenous relationships to fire is different. Fire is seen as a positive entity. Fire has agency. Fire can be a teacher, demonstrating for us how to be with country. Cultural burning in New South Wales means walking with fire, to be cooperative with country, rather than one force trying to dominate the other. Here, cultural burning processes are slower. The fire is often travelling at walking pace, and fire is left to lead its own burn path, often leaving areas unburnt, which are refuge for small animals and insects during the fire, and food for other animals after the fire. The fire temperatures and the flame heights are also lower, and natural fire breaks occur. What's also different are that children are encouraged to participate in cultural burning. And I did mention there were some similarities. So the similarities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous fire are that both have an understanding for fire and a respect for fire as its potentially damaging force. Fire must be carefully considered and respected to reduce the the risks of damaging wildfires, especially as our human population ever expands and increasingly encroaches on bushland, particularly in Australia with our highly flammable forest species. We also know that fire is necessary in Australia to encourage optimal species diversity. There are some species that need their particular right type of fire to be able to survive and to regenerate. So a disparity exists with the majority of research on Aboriginal people and natural resource management, which is focused in areas of the continent other than the southeast, as this indicative map is showing you. However, we know that Indigenous peoples exist across the continent, including in the southeast, and it's down here in the southeast where the majority of the total Indigenous population also live. So it's appropriate that we address this gap in knowledge. And thankfully, this disparity representation is changing. The research and scholarship on Aboriginal cultural burning in these areas is increasing. And what's positive about this is that much of this is producing publications that are authored or co-authored by Aboriginal people and centering the voices of Aboriginal people in these publications. So in the southeast, it is an exciting time for Aboriginal people, especially for Aboriginal women in cultural burning. So we know prior to colonisation that Aboriginal women were just as active and engaged in the landscape as were Aboriginal men, Indigenous men. They were caring for women's places, our resources, and maintaining our knowledge systems. We know this through the oral histories held strong in the communities, and these are also reflected in some colonial documents like we see here. This is an excerpt from the diary of colonial explorer Thomas Mitchell, who 70 years after European colonisation wrote, "Fire, grass, kangaroos and human inhabitants all seem dependent on each other for existence. The native applies that fire to the grass at certain seasons in order that a young green crop may subsequently spring up and so attract and enable him to kill or take a kangaroo. It's females and children who chiefly burn the grass." So we can see there that, you know, capturing that history in that diary. So we know that women had and have roles in caring for country. My research centres and amplifies the voices of Aboriginal women in relation to cultural burning in New South Wales, particularly as for many, cultural burning is an activity that is being revived in the southeast. Furthermore, caring for country activities and programs are predominantly male. And as a minority group, Aboriginal women experience intersectional challenges to their full participation in caring for country. Thus, my research and participation seeks to empower and promote Aboriginal women's perspectives. So I just want to show a quick little video from one of the fire workshops. Can I get this to work? If I just jump out of this screen and go to here.
I worked in national.
Hold on, sorry. I just need to move this around.
For 16 years, and I noticed in the role that I was in as a field officer was quite.
I'll just start that again.
I worked in national parks for 16 years, and I noticed in the role that I was in as a field officer was quite often the only female in the group. During the summertime, we'd go out and do firefighting, and I was quite often, you know, one of a few women and one of a few Aboriginal people. So it was always this male-dominated space.
What about you, Emmy? Can you do that?
I'm doing my PhD at the University of Wollongong, and the topic of my PhD is Aboriginal women in cultural burning in New South Wales. At the moment, talking with Aboriginal women around New South Wales about what they are doing in cultural burning and also about what they want to do with cultural burning. So some of that aspirational and hopes for the future. And a lot of it is what, you know, I've been able to do here at this workshop is getting the kids involved, getting other women involved, making sure that there's space for women's voices in this, in the forum and in what's happening. In the future, I'd like to see that Aboriginal women, regardless of where they are, that they know that they can come and participate in these cultural burning workshops and in the forums. I'd hate to think that there are other Aboriginal women who have those same ideas or perceptions that I did before I started getting involved, thinking that it was for a male-only space. And sure, there might be some cultural protocols that for some mobs it may not be appropriate for women, but it certainly has been my experience that the men that have been involved in cultural burning, when the women have come along, that they've been really excited and welcoming and supportive of Aboriginal women's participation in this space. It's more than cultural burning, it's about caring for country and caring for community and caring for our continuity of our existence. That's why I brought my kids along to this week's forum. It's been a brilliant experience for them. Yorta Yorta Mob have been beautiful and they've been really strong and they've been really, you know, great hosts, having us there. Even in the campground, they saw some of us women carrying logs to our fire and they said, no, you don't carry, you know, you come and get us. We'll take logs to your fire. And they'd come around in a buggy and dropped off a load of firewood to our little camp, you know, and it's that kind of, that real personal connection of we're in their home and we're welcome there and they're looking after us while we're here. So it's really beautiful.
Okay. All right. So I'll just close that one. And I'll go back to my screen sharing. Okay. I hope you can all still see and hear me. So my research does not aim to collect traditional knowledge or sensitive stories about cultural burning, nor does it aim to define what cultural burning is. Rather, it is intended to understand how women are participating and identify any barriers or challenges to their full participation, so that these might be addressed to assist in making cultural burning more gender equitable where appropriate. So I'm a social scientist. My research is qualitative, performative and participatory. It's action research. It involves doing semi-structured interviews and focus groups with Aboriginal women, and my research seeks to support, advocate and amplify the voices of Aboriginal women. So you can see that's in some of those images. So cultural burning is important for many reasons. The women have told me that cultural burning has facilitated their access to country, to areas that would have otherwise excluded Aboriginal people. For example, Aboriginal people have been able to access private property through cultural burning. It can be a mechanism to establish cooperative engagement between Indigenous people and private property owners. And over time, this opens up opportunities for conversations, education, and perhaps mutual relationships. Cultural burning can also mean that Aboriginal people are spending more time walking country, and this can lead to increased monitoring and care for cultural heritage sites and resources in the landscape. It can also improve the health of country by removing weeds and identifying management problems. We all know that country is healthier when people are active on it and with it. Cultural burning can also encourage the maintenance of culture for individuals and for communities through returning to country, embedding the attachment of place and cultural obligations of caring for country. So in doing this, we can encourage maintaining relationships of community and family, and this can facilitate intergenerational knowledge transfer. It can also mean the cultural enrichment of oneself, building up the cultural identity and well-being, like you saw with me and my kids in that last video. In terms of the agencies and the fire departments, cultural burning can transform the way that fire is perceived and interacted with. cultural burning can also stimulate a range of new social interactions between agencies and Aboriginal people and communities, furthering reconciliation efforts. So on the screen here is a photo of my daughter, Emma. It's on Wonnarua country, so her grandfather's land. And on this day, she's lighting her very first cultural burn. On this day, she was welcomed and watched by Wonnarua elders. She was surrounded by other Aboriginal people who were teaching and guiding her. My dad had passed away several years before this event, and this was the first time since the disruption of colonisation that my family members have been able to return to country to enact these responsibilities of caring for country and Wonnarua country. And in the background there, you can see there's non-Indigenous people, fire department staff and members who are watching Emma light her cultural burn, and they're hoping for a better future for her and hoping for her to do her best. So it's you know, it's emotional, it's important, it's connecting us back with country. So I'm in the middle of my data collection and I've got some preliminary outcomes. The women that I've talked to are showing that they're all already engaging with, or they're interested in engaging with cultural burning. Some women are just seeking guidance on how to engage with cultural burns as participants, and others are looking to find out how to plan for and undertake cultural burns. Women have also spoken about their experiences of marginalisation, and I'll show you some of that next. And they've also spoken about why it's important for Aboriginal women to be involved in cultural landscape activities. So my research finds that Aboriginal women have experienced different levels of marginalisation. As I mentioned earlier, caring for country programs are disproportionately male, and this can be unfavourable for women. Some women simply won't attend because the programs are too male dominated. And you can see in this quote here, and I'll just read that underlined bit. So I feel like not a lot has changed, and it still doesn't feel like a very welcoming or safe place for us. I know that I definitely feel that myself, but I put up with a lot of stuff because I know that this is important, what I'm doing. So that's from an Aboriginal female participant in cultural burning activities in landscape management. These next two quotes also identifies experiences of marginalisation, but also looking at the important roles that women have in caring for country and cultural burning. The first one says, it reinforces that our cultural rites of passage as Aboriginal women in a matriarchal society, and it's a practice we would have traditionally done. And you know, we all know through colonisation that that patriarchal line has taken some of our rites of passage away. But I think it's also important for Aboriginal women to be involved in cultural burning because they're the ones who we're going to rely on to pass that knowledge down to their children, to their grandchildren and that. To me, it's more important. That's the most important part of having women involved because traditionally our women are teachers. Another Aboriginal woman reflected a similar message. It's really important because it's part of our responsibility as Aboriginal people. And there are spaces that are female spaces and our women need to be looking after those spaces. But also women are the teachers of the children primarily when they're growing up. And so it's teaching them about it as well. Some of the other things that women have talked about, they said that the fires that we see today are too hot and that country is too dry. And this is the result of years of mismanagement. Country is sick, which is reflected in making our people sick. Indigenous Australians have the highest suicide rates in the world, the highest incarceration rates in the world, and Australia has the highest mammal extinction rates in the world. And the social factors disproportionately impact Indigenous women. So burning at the right time means that country is healthy, that the waterways are healthy, and the plants and animals are healthy, and the people will be healthy too. Women want country healthy so that we can gather our weaving fibres, our bush medicines and resources and not have them burnt out at the wrong time. And finally, my positionality is also important in this research. It's in this research for many reasons: as an Aboriginal woman myself, as an auntie, as a mother, as a teacher and a scholar. I'm researching and simultaneously contributing to the ways that Aboriginal women engage. Before becoming an academic, I worked for many years in the New South Wales environmental conservation sector, where I built up strong networks with cultural burning practitioners, knowledge holders, government and agency staff. I was trained up to remote area fire team member level, and all of this was Western training. Cultural burning and Indigenous knowledge was not a part of this formal training. And I now sit on the New South Wales Cultural Burning Working Group, where I advocate for Aboriginal women's engagement, as I did recently in the National Natural Disaster Royal Commission. So the Royal Commission was interested in the ways in which traditional land and fire management practices of Indigenous Australians could improve Australia's resilience to natural disasters, including wildfires. So in preparation as a witness for this, I spoke to many Aboriginal women from across the country. And they said that they want to maintain our values and responsibilities in the landscape. And this is why Aboriginal women need to be included at every level. Women need to be active in caring for country so we can care for those special women's places in the landscape, and so we can maintain our stories and our practices. We need to reflect the diversity of Indigenous nations and gender. Women are needed in cultural burning and land management to maintain balance. Where we need to do this in ways that involve our children, because as mothers, we are their first teachers, and children must be intimately connected to the processes of caring for country and culture. It is fundamental learning and really important for their futures. Women and kids need to be able to attend cultural burns with their families, with their elders, and with their communities. We need to be able to do this because it builds up our resilience as a people and for us all to be healthy. So finally, my main call to action is for specific targeted strategies aimed to engage with Aboriginal women, because we know that unless when women are purposefully supported, that we will miss out. If you really want to learn about cultural burning and Indigenous land management, then you first need to be able to listen and support women as equal decision makers and knowledge holders. And that needs to happen over the long term with secure resourcing for women's roles. But overall, the women that I've spoken to are hopeful, and we want to see genuine outcomes of collaboration and shared goals for a sustainable future. So I'll leave it there and say, Boogle Bear, thank you. Done. Stop sharing.
Vanessa, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed hearing about the role of Aboriginal women in these cultural burning practices. So thank you so much. Let's jump right into the questions. Our first one is from Pooja, who's wondering, what are the impacts of colonization on communities who are not able to practice cultural burning?
Absolutely. Look, like I don't think I said it in my presentation, but cultural burning for the main part of the communities in the southeast is a process that's just going fairly recent revival. And, you know, that's been over the past decade and a half. Whereas there's other places across Australia who have been able to maintain the cultural burning practices without much disruption from colonisation. But certainly it's more recent here in the southeast. But even in saying that, there are some pockets of communities who have maintained their cultural practices, you know, in ways that, you know, that they've been able to continue that despite the impacts of colonisation. So sometimes that's, you know, if they've got relationships with maybe national parks, estates, or, you know, government lands. Sometimes they have lands through their local land council, that the Aboriginal Land Council have got lands that they manage themselves, and those cultural activities are able to be maintained in the privacy of that of that land management. And sometimes there are private property owners who also interact well and encourage engagement with Aboriginal communities. But certainly, you know, Indigenous people in Australia are increasingly urban. And so with that, you know, just with the fact of living in cities, it's hard to access those natural environments to maintain those cultural practices and protocols. And many people like myself are Indigenous but not living on our traditional homelands. So, you know, being able to get back home to practice those cultural activities can be difficult, especially if there's long distances involved.
Thank you.
Question.
And as a follow-up, Rhea is wondering, how might areas that have lost these cultural bonds to fire and that have no Indigenous traditions learn from cultural burning practices? So what can these people learn from those that currently practice?
Yeah, sorry, I just missed the start of that, Mario.
Yeah, of course, sorry. How might areas that have lost cultural bonds to fire and have no active Indigenous traditions learn from cultural burning practices?
Yeah, sure. So there's certainly a collaborative approach. So learning from other, you know, nearby Aboriginal nations, knowledge exchange. A lot of people, you know, also acknowledge that a lot of the knowledge around country is bound up in country, and that knowledge is there. And the most important thing is getting local Aboriginal people back out on country and accessing places so that they can reconnect with country, and that, you know, learning about, you know, what are some of those cultural protocols and being able to put them into place. Yeah.
Thank you. And Bethany's one says, love what you're doing. What would you say are the 3 primary barriers to women's involvement in cultural burning practices for those who are hesitant to get involved? And what are some of the engagement techniques that you use to, or are seeing to overcome these barriers?
Sure. Look, I don't think, you know, in terms of prioritising them, this is the top barrier. You know, there's just, I'll just mention a couple of different barriers. Sometimes it's just perception. Like, as I said in the video before I started my PhD, I was thinking that cultural burning was a more male-oriented activity. And it wasn't until I started to actually participate and learn more about it and, you know, go and listen to some of, you know, women from different areas, and they're talking about it being matrilineal activity. So realizing that, yeah, you know, this is part of that taking on the, you know, patriarchal, colonial, you know, that caring for country or being out on country is a male activity. It's like, no, that's silly to think about that. Prior to colonisation, we were all out on country all the time. So of course women have roles in caring for country. So sometimes it's perception. Other times it can be, you know, Aboriginal women are just incredibly busy women, you know, with maintaining connections with their, you know, looking after kids or looking after elders, and maintaining activities in community. There's a lot of brilliant, you know, Indigenous men and dads that do similar things, but, you know, the women that I've talked to, I think, well, the fact that they're able to engage with caring for country and cultural burning is on top of many other, you know, responsibilities that they have as well. So, you know, sometimes it's just burning the candle at both ends, and how much can you actually get done. It's not because it's not something that women want to do, they certainly want to, but being able to have the time and energy and resources to be able to do it and do it well is a restriction. And then also, like I mentioned, you know, this is a reviving activity here in the Southeast. And, you know, it's only been this summer that I have noticed a real shift in people's interest in Aboriginal knowledge and cultural burning knowledge, and a genuine desire to learn more. So prior to that, you know, I was a firefighter, and cultural burning was never, you know, a part of caring, like landscape management. And so it's trying to change those cultural norms of the way fire is managed with all of the agencies, not just with Aboriginal communities, but with the fire departments as well, and the land management agencies. And that's something that, you know, the New South Wales National Parks Service have developed a cultural burning policy, but that's only been developed in the past decade. So prior to that, you know, there was fire management, but it's all looking at Western models of land management and science.
I see. Andy Elliott asks, Vanessa, I'm convinced that similar cultural burns once existed in the West. I'm also convinced that these were happier fires. In these times of growing global concern around wildfires, how do we convince land agencies and governments that happier cultural fires are the way forward?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. I think agencies are starting to really come to the party, you know, and that the more, I think for me, the way in has been, you know, when I was working in national parks and being able to learn about the ways that, you know, landscape management, not just cultural burning, but land management is undertaken within those agencies. So employment within agencies and being able to infiltrate the system in a way is a good way to get in. But also just the general public's responses to these types of issues and, you know, writing to local members or, you know, writing letters to the editor or just advocating for Indigenous knowledge systems or different ways of responding to these natural hazards is useful.
Great. And from Catalina asks, here in Northwest Europe, we are seeing fires in regions not traditionally used to fire. What can these newly fire-prone regions learn from Aboriginal cultural burning and the focus on gender diversity that you discussed?
Yeah. Well, I guess it kind of depends on what the ecosystems are. So I'd be resistant to, you know, suggest that cultural burning can make a difference. But, you know, there's certainly been knowledge exchange between, we've had Indigenous fire practitioners come across from Canada and the US to come and learn from cultural burning practitioners here in Australia, and I think there's some that have come across from Africa or Botswana as well. So knowledge exchange is certainly something that's happening, and Indigenous knowledges around environmental issues globally is something that I think needs to be brought to the fore more prominently as we enter climate change, you know, because even for Aboriginal people here in Australia, you know, we've been here for thousands of years. We've lived through ice ages and we've experienced climate change, and we have oral histories around some of those climatic events, and that knowledge is worthwhile and valid in the you know, the rapidly dynamic reality that we're in at the moment.
Thank you. Our next question asks if you can speak a little bit more about intergenerational learning in cultural burning practices, particularly women teaching girls. Are there any efforts to specifically target that gender dynamic to create a safe, supportive learning environment for girls at a young age? Or in your observation experience, is it simply important for intergenerational learning to occur regardless of gender?
Look, I think that that's certainly something that will come up in the future, and that it's something that, you know, it should be available for women specific, like gender specific roles and intergenerational knowledge transfer. At the moment, it's probably just down here in the southeast, like in New South Wales, it's more about just having the children come along and experience those, you know, have those experiences with family. I can't see what happens in other parts of the continent, but I would be surprised if that wasn't already taking place in other places where there were specific women's camps or women's burning practices and knowledge sharing, and the same with the men. But, you know, that's not my place to say. But yeah, certainly that's something that we are hoping is an outcome and continues to be an outcome for all people, you know, for elders just as much as it is for children to be able to share those stories of country and knowledge around place, and instilling that cultural identity and strength and pride in our younger generations. Yeah.
Thank you. Kathleen asks, how do you navigate both your role as a researcher in a westernized institution and your identity as an Aboriginal woman and fire practitioner?
Yeah. Oh, well, first of all, I'm not a cultural burning practitioner. I'm a researcher. So, yeah, I'm researching cultural burning, but I'm not a knowledge holder around cultural burning. But in terms of how do I negotiate the two worlds, I think that's something that we do as Indigenous people from day dot. You know, we grow up in two worlds, so we have to be able to, you know, negotiate those interfaces. And it's something like all cultures in the world, we're dynamic and we're evolving and we're growing, and we're also learning and unpacking some of that history. So, you know, when I started my presentation here today, I introduced myself in my mother's language. And that was not something that I have grown up doing. It's only something that I probably started to do in the past 3 years, is to honour and privilege the Indigenous, like my Indigenous identity when I speak, because I want to say who I am as an Aboriginal woman in my own language first, rather than speaking in the colonial, you know, dominant narrative, even though that's part of colonisation, you know, that a lot of our language has been disrupted. I want to try and maintain that wherever I can. And if it's just by introducing myself in my language, then that's one step closer than what I was 3 years ago. So it's a process.
Yeah, absolutely. And our final question for today is from Carmen Rodriguez, who says, thanks, Vanessa, for your presentation. I was wondering whether you found Aboriginal women who are not willing to live up to the traditional ways of doing their people and cultural background, maybe younger generations, for example, who would rather embrace the Western ways.
I don't know whether it's that they would rather embrace it and they're giving up anything. Like I said, you know, there's all sorts of diversity that exists, and you know, for some women, like I'm very much interested in being in nature. I've worked in national parks. I've always been interested in environmental conservation, but you know, for other women, that's not something that they're interested in. You know, there's women that are interested in all types of, you know, academic, you know, in interests or personal interests, and so that's not to say that they think that their culture should be disregarded. It might just be that that's not where their personal interests lie. But I have not met many Aboriginal women, or any Aboriginal women or Aboriginal people, who think that our culture shouldn't be maintained or preserved, or that don't engage in cultural activities where they can. It's something that, you know, if there's an opportunity to engage with culture, then we're more likely to be able to do that.
Vanessa, thank you so much. That was the end of our questioning.
No worries.
And it was really, I feel like we all learned a lot. So I really appreciate it.
Good. Thank you. Boogle Bear.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Lisa and Vanessa for the really interesting and emotional presentations. And thank you all for attending.